Welcome everybody. This is Dark Ascent. Today I'm showcasing what one of the highest peaks in the world did to a rich, arrogant woman who paid to skip the one thing on a mountain that no money can buy. She was fit, experienced, and rich enough to hire one of the best guides on the mountain, but waved away his every warning. The brutal thing he was ultimately forced to do next is the kind of thing that ruins careers and haunts lives. It was the 3rd of October, 2023, high on the mountain called Cho Oyu, the 6th highest on Earth, where a 52-year-old woman from Dallas, Texas, who had told her guides more than once that she had paid extra so she would not have to wait around, finally ran into the one thing her money could not move, which was her own physiology, still behaving as though it belonged near sea level, even as the rest of her stood at 23,000 feet. Her name was Ramona Prentice. She was 52 years old, and she came from Dallas, Texas, where she had built a staffing company out of nothing and sold it for a sum that changed the rest of her life. And the first thing to understand about her is that she was not some pampered tourist who had never suffered for anything. She had clawed her way up from a rented room and 2 jobs, and she had a shelf in her study that proved she could suffer on a mountain, with photographs from the tops of Kilimanjaro, Elbrus, and Aconcagua over her desk. She trained hard and honestly. She was strong for her age, and the guides who later worked with her all said the same thing, that her fitness was real and her willpower was frightening. The trouble was never her body in the gym. The trouble was the belief she had carried up from the bottom of her life to the top of her career. The belief that had never once failed her, that any obstacle would eventually move if you threw enough money, effort, and sheer refusal at it. She ran her own expedition the way she had run her company, with a laminated schedule, a daily list of numbers to hit, and a habit of treating every person around her as either an asset or an obstacle. She tipped enormously and expected priority in return. She took business calls by satellite from the tents when the signal allowed, and her brand new, top-of-the-range down suit still held the creases from the shop. None of that made her a bad climber. It made her a woman who had never once in her adult life been in a situation that money and force of will could not eventually bend. Cho Oyu was not even meant to be the prize. It was meant to be the warm-up, the box she ticked to get ready for Everest the following spring, the easy 8,000er that everybody said was the gentle one. And that word, easy, is where this whole story quietly begins to go wrong. You can still find the way she talked about it before she left, because she was proud of the plan, and she shared it the way she shared everything, as a kind of masterclass in efficiency. In one post, she laid out the schedule she had bought, a rapid ascent program that would put her on top of an 8,000er in 18 days, where the traditional way takes 4 to 6 weeks, and she wrote about it the way she wrote about closing a deal, all momentum and no wasted motion. She talked about the altitude tent she slept in at home, about pre-acclimatizing on her own time so she would not have to burn weeks sitting in a cold tent halfway up a mountain. She talked about paying for the best, about how the people who tell you it cannot be rushed are usually the same people who could never afford to rush it. A line that reads very differently now. Reading it now is a strange and heavy thing, because every single word of it sounds so reasonable, so competent, so much like a woman who had thought of everything, right up until you remember what a mountain does to a body that has not been given time. Money bought her almost everything on that mountain. The gear, the fast schedule, the private tent, the extra hands. But I promise you, it could not buy the one quiet thing her body was actually begging her for. To understand what killed Ramona Prentice, you have to understand the thing she was trying to skip. Acclimatization is not a mood or a mindset. It is a physical process, the slow adapting of every major system in the body, faster breathing first, then shifts in blood chemistry, a fall in plasma volume, and eventually the making of more red blood cells to survive on a fraction of the oxygen you evolved for. Go up too high too fast, and the body has not had time for those adjustments, and the pressure inside the tiny blood vessels of the lungs can climb so high that fluid is forced into the air spaces, while swelling develops within the brain itself. This is why real expeditions climb in a patient ladder of rotations, up to a higher camp, back down to rest, up a little higher, back down again, over weeks, coaxing the body into keeping up. There's even a drug that helps the process along, but it only nudges a body already doing the work, and it cannot manufacture the weeks that work takes. In recent years, an industry has grown up promising to shorten that ladder, using tents at home that thin the air you breathe while you sleep. So a client arrives, already partly adapted and can climb in a fraction of the time. Done properly, by disciplined people who follow every step for months and never skip a night, it can truly work. And strong climbers have used it well. Done the way Ramona did it, squeezed in around business trips, and half believed, with a tent abandoned whenever her real life got busy. It left her arriving at the foot of an 8,000er with a body that still thought it was standing in Texas. She had her own training records showing she had completed the program. Her body had never actually completed the adaptation, and adaptation is the only thing the mountain reads, and she had chosen, of all the giants, the one whose reputation made that gamble feel safe, because Cho Oyu is spoken of as the most forgiving of the 14 highest mountains. The beginner's 8,000er, a phrase that has quietly helped kill many people. She had stood on the summits of Kilimanjaro and Aconcagua and Elbrus, and I want you to hold that in your mind, because it is exactly these achievements that would usually have anyone think this would be a walk in the park as well. The mountain she picked sits on the border of Nepal and Tibet, and she would climb it from the Tibetan side, the normal route, which begins not with a long walk but with a long drive. You are carried by road across the high Tibetan plateau and delivered in a day or two to Chinese base camp at around 16,000 feet, a gain that alone would leave most unprepared people with severe altitude illness. From there, the route climbs to advanced base camp at around 19,000 feet, then up through a steep band of ice and the fixed ropes above it to a line of high camps, Camp 1, Camp 2, and Camp 3, and finally the broad summit plateau, nearly 27,000 feet up. It is not a technically brutal climb by the standards of the Great Mountains, which is precisely its danger, because it lets people with no business at that altitude get high enough to die. That gentle reputation is a trap, and Cho Oyu has quietly killed a long list of people who came expecting a walk. Her operator was a boutique outfit that specialized in experienced clients using documented pre-acclimatization programs, led on the mountain by a quietly experienced Sherpa named Ngawang. Working with an assistant Sherpa and a small support team between them had summited that peak more times than she would ever know. And there was one more fact about the Tibetan side that Ramona, for all her planning, seems never to have truly absorbed. On this side of the range, there is effectively no high-altitude helicopter rescue. On the Nepali side, a sick climber can sometimes be plucked from high on the mountain by a pilot willing to fly to the edge of what a machine can do. But here, under a different government and its rules, there is no such lifeline. If you cannot get yourself down or be carried down by hand, you very often do not get down at all. And that single fact means a climber who cannot walk out has to be carried down by hand, turning every hour of delay into lost ground. Altitude does not read your bank statement, and it does not care how strong you were at sea level. And that is the merciless little lesson I have watched this mountain teach again and again. By every account from the team, Ramona arrived behind where she should have been, and she waved away their concern. She had not slept in the altitude tent nearly as faithfully as her plan assumed, and the fast drive up onto the plateau hit her hard, with the pounding headaches and broken, gasping sleep, and the flattened appetite that are the body's first honest signals it is being asked for too much too soon. Ngawang, who had seen this many times, checked the little pulse oximeter on her finger and did not like the combination of her oxygen readings and the way she looked, and he reminded her, as gently as he could, that the rapid plan only worked if her acclimatization at home had been done exactly as instructed. He advised extra rest days, another night low before going high, the ladder taken more slowly, exactly the thing the schedule had been built to avoid. This is where her real competence and her fatal flaw sat side by side, because in some things she was truly wise. She looked after her feet. She managed her gear with a care that impressed men who had seen everything. She once turned back early from a bitter morning when a lesser client would have pushed and paid for it. She was not reckless in the small things, but every time the mountain and the Sherpas asked her for the one thing that truly mattered, which was time, she answered with the same sentence in different words, that she had paid for a rapid ascent and did not intend to sit in a tent watching slower teams file past her toward the top. She kept her own spreadsheet of her resting heart rate and her oxygen readings, updated by headlamp each night, and the awful thing, looking at it later, is that the numbers were right there in her own neat handwriting, sliding steadily the wrong way. and she kept logging them and kept climbing. A great deal of what happened in her last days was reconstructed afterward from the things she left behind, and they tell their own quiet story. There are voice memos she recorded for her assistant back in Texas, businesslike and clipped, noting that she was a day ahead of schedule and feeling, in her words, tired but fine. There are the readings saved on her oximeter and in her own careful spreadsheet, a column of numbers that any expedition doctor would have read with alarm, dropping lower at each camp than they had any right to. There is a short message sent to her family from Advanced Base Camp saying that the guides were being overly cautious and that she would be home, summit in hand, ahead of plan. And there is a photograph, time-stamped high on the mountain, of her boots and her brand new downsuit, the fabric still creased from the shop. A woman who had bought absolutely everything for this climb except the one thing that had no price tag. If you had spent more than most people earn in a year to be there, and a guide told you to turn around, would you have listened, or told yourself you paid to reach the top? Somewhere between Camp 1 and Camp 2, at around 23,000 feet, the warning stopped being subtle. Ramona developed a cough that would not settle, a wet, tearing cough that is one of the most feared sounds on any high mountain. And she found herself breathless, not just while climbing, but while sitting still, unable to get her breath back no matter how long she rested. At night she could not lie flat and had to prop herself upright to breathe, and by morning her lips carried the faint blue tinge that tells a guide the body is no longer getting the oxygen it needs. Ngawang checked her oxygen again, and this time the number frightened him, far lower than on the days before. And with the wet, bubbling sound in her breathing, it told him everything a mountain guide learns to dread. What was happening to her had a name: high-altitude pulmonary edema, fluid drowning her lungs from the inside because her body had never been given the weeks it needed to adapt. And there is only one true cure for it anywhere in the world, which is to go down, not slow down, not push through, not another dose of anything. Down immediately, losing altitude as fast as it can safely be lost, because every hour spent high is an hour the lungs keep filling. This time Ngawang did not put it to her as advice. He told her the climb was over and that they were going down now, and the assistant Sherpa said the same. By every account she was told, more than once, and still she refused, saying what she always had, that she had not come all that way and paid all that money to turn around thousands of feet below the top. People love to call a woman like her arrogant, and maybe she was, but I have learned the hard way that arrogance and raw courage very often wear the exact same face up there. What followed was not a sudden disaster, but a slow grinding standoff between a dying woman and the people trying to save her life. Ngawang radioed down to base camp and to the operator, and the message that came back was the only sensible one: to bring her down at once by any means possible. But Ramona was still at that point able to stand and to argue, and a guide cannot simply seize a grown client who insists she is fine and haul her off a mountain against her will, especially one who keeps repeating that she has paid for this and knows her own body better than they do. So they lost hours, the most precious currency on that mountain, to her refusal, hours in which the fluid kept rising in her lungs and the clock kept running down. By the time her condition had worsened past any argument, she appeared to be developing signs of both high-altitude pulmonary edema and high-altitude cerebral edema. The stumbling and slurring and strangely calm confusion that mean the swelling has reached the place that kills fastest. And by then the decision had been taken out of everyone's hands, including her own. Now they had to get a barely conscious woman down a steep mountain by muscle alone, clipping her to the fixed ropes, short roping her, half carrying and half lowering her, in a place where no helicopter would ever come no matter who was paying. Ngawang and the others did the things that actually treat this. Dexamethasone for the swelling in the brain, and for the lungs the real answer: bottled oxygen from a summit cylinder and immediate descent, with nifedipine added as the kind of stopgap that matters most when getting down is slow and no pressure bag is at hand. Everyone there knew the drugs could only buy time, and they started down through the cold and the failing light, knowing how much ground the lost hours had already cost. Nothing about her climb was a sudden accident, and that is the part that haunts me, because the mountain sent warning after warning that she had paid in advance to ignore. It is worth being clear about what was happening inside her, because it explains why neither the money nor the willpower could save her in the end. The rapid climb had never let her body build what it needed, and so at altitude, fluid was forced out of her blood vessels, where it did not belong, first into her lungs, which stole her breath and filled her chest with that terrible crackle, and then swelling within her brain itself, which stole her balance, her judgment, and finally her consciousness. In most climbers, the lungs give trouble first, and the cough and the breathlessness are the mountain's last polite knock before it stops knocking, though the two can arrive together. Both conditions are, in principle, survivable, but only if the person gets down fast, and only if they are caught early, and she had used up her early hours arguing. The drugs a strong team carries, and, if one was available nearby, a portable pressure bag that can mimic thicker air for a while can slow the clock, but they do not stop it, and they are meant to buy just enough time to descend, not to replace it. By the time they were moving her, she could no longer walk or help herself, and with the hours already lost to her refusal, carrying a limp climber down by hand was too slow to shed the altitude she needed in time. What was most likely killing her, any expedition doctor reviewing the records afterward would conclude, was the combination the mountain reserves for the unacclimatized. The lungs and the brain, failing together, hurried along by cold and exhaustion, and the thin, merciless air, a death far less common among climbers who take the time to acclimatize properly. Everything that went wrong with her body that week had a name, a cause, and a known cure, and I think that is the single cruelest fact in this entire story. No single person saw every moment of Ramona's final descent, and no account from that altitude is ever perfectly complete. What was later understood came from Ngawang's account, the assistant Sherpa who helped move her, other climbers who encountered them on the fixed ropes, base camp radio logs, readings saved from her pulse oximeter, her own spreadsheet and voice memos, and the devices recovered with her gear after the descent. Together, those records showed the same basic sequence: worsening altitude illness, repeated warnings to descend, hours lost to refusal, and a rescue effort that began only after her body had already lost too much ground to the altitude. By those accounts, she was, near the end, no longer able to walk or to speak clearly, and the men around her carried and lowered her as far and as fast as broken bodies at that altitude can manage another human being. Other climbers described a knot of Sherpas fighting to move a limp figure down through the ice, and described giving up their own bottled oxygen and their own dwindling strength to help, because that is simply what climbers do for one another up there. What none of them can tell you, and what this channel will not pretend to know, is what she was thinking as the mountain closed around her, because that is the one thing she did not leave behind in a spreadsheet or a voice memo, and the one thing she took with her. Ramona Prentice died high on Cho Oyu, on the descent, most likely of the combined swelling in her lungs and her brain, hurried along by exhaustion and the cold, with Ngawang still at her side when she went. He and the others had managed to move her some way down the mountain, but not nearly far enough, not to the thick air that might have saved her, and somewhere on that cold slope, hours after the first cough that should have sent her running for base camp, her body simply finished what the altitude had started. Ngawang survived. He came down off that mountain hollowed out and frostbitten at the fingers, carrying a weight that was never his to carry, because he had done everything a guide could possibly do, and had still watched a client die of the one illness that the additional acclimatization time she kept refusing might have prevented. Everything we know of her last hours, we know because he lived to tell it, and because there were enough climbers on the route that other teams witnessed parts of the end. She was not killed by a storm, or an avalanche, or a fall, or any of the dramatic deaths the mountains are famous for. She was killed by arithmetic, by a body that had been asked to skip the only part of the climb that could not be skipped. Getting her body down was its own long ordeal, lowered and carried by Sherpas down the high mountain, and only loaded onto yak once the ground eased far below. The patient, grim work of people who do this, so that families have something to bury, because on that side of the mountain, there is no swift machine to lift the dead away any more than there is one to lift the living. Her death became a quiet scandal in the small world of high-altitude climbing, one more name in a growing argument about the rapid ascent programs and the operators who trust clients to honestly complete months of pre-acclimatization at home, about whether it is ever right to promise a wealthy client that the mountain can be fitted into a busy calendar. Other guides who heard it recognized it at once, because they had all met a version of her, the strong, successful client who treats the itinerary as a suggestion and the guide as an employee, and cannot quite believe the rules apply to them. The operator's rapid itinerary assumed every client had completed months of disciplined pre-acclimatization before arriving, and on paper, Ramona had done exactly that. Only later did it emerge the program had been followed inconsistently, leaving her far less prepared than anyone realized. But it is also true that no one had held a gun to her head, and that the guides on the mountain had begged her, in their calm and careful way, to do the one thing that would have saved her and had been told no. What came down off Cho Oyu in the end was not just a body, but a lesson the mountain keeps trying to teach and that people keep paying good money not to hear. Time was the only thing that could have saved her. Plain, slow, ordinary time to let her body catch up to the sky. And it's the one thing I wish to God that somebody could have made her buy. I have thought a long time about how to tell this story without turning Ramona Prentice into a joke because it would be so easy and so wrong. She was demanding, used to getting her way, and treated people who worked for her as pieces on a board. And all of that is true, and none of it made her deserve to drown in her own lungs on a mountainside. She was also brave and disciplined and self-made, a woman who had beaten longer odds than most of us face, and it was those very qualities, the refusal to quit and the certainty that effort and money always win, that carried her past every warning to her death. There is no villain here, only a system willing to promise that months of acclimatization could be squeezed into a busy professional schedule, and a woman primed her whole life to believe it. It is tempting to make her the villain of her own story, the entitled client who got what she asked for. But that is too easy and untrue, because gentler people have died on that mountain for the same reason, and plenty exactly like her up there right now, paying to skip the wait. The mountain did not hate her. It simply does not negotiate. It does not take payment, and it does not care in the slightest what you have overcome to reach its feet. It asks every person who comes to it for the same two things, time and humility, and those are the two things she had spent a lifetime proving to herself she could do without. What Ngawang carried down off that mountain was not really Ramona at all. It was only the memory of her last hours, and I do not believe he has had an easy night's sleep since. I do not tell this story to sneer at a dead woman who cannot answer back, because there is nothing clever in mocking her, and there is a warning in her that has nothing to do with money and everything to do with the rest of us. Almost all of us believe, somewhere deep down, that the rules that bind other people can be worked around with enough effort, enough cleverness, enough refusal to accept a no, and almost all of the time, in the world we have built, that belief is rewarded. The mountains are one of the last places on earth that will not play along, that take your money and your confidence and your laminated schedule and hand you back the same non-negotiable terms they handed the first climber who ever stood at their feet. Ramona Prentice was told, gently and then desperately, that her body needed time she had decided not to give it. She had beaten every other obstacle in her life by refusing to accept its terms, by working harder and paying more and outlasting the no, and she climbed toward this one with the same fierce certainty, and the mountain, which has never once been for sale, simply let her.